somebody who's not Japanese or somebody who's darker skinned, whatever, sitting on a train, and they just don't know what the person will do.
純日本人とか言うの。純っていう言葉を使うの。pure.
Yeah.
例えば、あの子ちょっとハーフっぽいねみたいな。いや、うちの両親ともどっちも日本人で純日本人ですみたいな。
Welcome to the lazyfluency podcast, where you have casual conversations switching between English and Japanese, so you can learn from and with us along the way. I'm Joey.
And I'm Yummy.
And the topic of the day is xenophobia. Before we get into that, make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and or drop a review on whatever platform you're listening on. We appreciate the support. And with that out of the way, xenophobia. Japanese people are nice. Japanese people are friendly. But what does it mean to be Japanese? And how will you be treated if you aren't Japanese? Today we're talking about xenophobia as well as what it means to be Japanese, because the whole notion of xenophobia is like fear of others, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But to know, yeah.
他人を恐れるっていうのかな。
Yeah.
対人恐怖症
Yeah, exactly. Well,
まあちょっと違うか。
no, that's different. That's different. That's well, there's another word for that. But anyways, to define what you're afraid of, like foreign or whatever, you kind of need to define what is not foreign. And as there's an inspiration for a comment or that inspired this episode later down, we'll talk about it in like section 3. But something else that inspired this episode was a while back, there was a documentary released by I can't remember what the channel is, My Life in Japan or something, called, no, I think it's My Life in Japan, called Being Japanese, in Japanese, 日本人とは. And I'm not going to go into exactly like all the different sectors of what it means to be Japanese and all that. But just for some context in the episode, a lot of people might be listening and think, oh, I know what a Japanese person is, whatever. It's actually a fairly difficult, question for any ethnicity or any group of people to say what defines them. But I took a chart that's discussed in this larger documentary that I think is very helpful. And I'll put it up on screen. But just basically briefly covering it, there are, I think, 7 different categories of things that contribute to you being Japanese, basically. Or if you match this criteria, or the stronger you match in a given criteria, the easier it is, or the less problems you'll have in society being viewed as Japanese. I guess that's how I would define these things. So I'll read them out real quick. Nationality, your genetics, genes, language competence, place of birth, current residence, level of cultural literacy, and then subjective identity.
Language competence は完璧かどうかってこと?
No, how good? No, for example, like Naoki, the tennis player, can't speak Japanese. Like Naoki. Very basic. Wasn't it Naoki or whatever?
Naomi?
Naomi, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Naomi. Yeah, she speaks very like elementary Japanese. So that's what that's talking about. There are a bunch of different examples of different types of Japanese people. I'll read some of them so you have an idea of what I mean by it being complicated. For example, Korean residents not naturalized in Japan. Japanese business posted overseas. This is Ainu naturalized foreigners. First generation overseas who forfeited Japanese citizenship. Children of Japanese overseas settlers. Most immigrant workers in Japan. And third generation Japanese Brazilians working in Japan, etc., etc. There's a bunch of different examples. They meet some or most or part of some of these criterias. And the real question is, at what point is someone Japanese? At what point is somebody not Japanese? So just keep that in mind as we're going through the episode. Although we're going to be talking about, I think, we're just going to assume that we understand what we're talking about when we're saying Japanese and focus on people who are clearly not in that Japanese category. But even within Japanese people themselves, there's a pretty big question and levels to being Japanese. And so the first thing I want to say, I think there's no way we haven't discussed this before, the notion of uchi and soto.
いや、そんな話してはないと思うけど。
Yeah. But do you want to give your take?
内と外どういう意味で日本人がどう内と外を見てるかみたいな。
Well, yeah, in terms of, I guess you could say anthropology, like what those, obviously not their literal meanings, but also what kind of the concept as to how it affects.
なんだろう、例えばある集団があって、その集団と、見た目であったり考え方が違うと、もう外って見てる気がする。
Yeah.
みんなと違うと外。
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
うん
I do believe this has come up in like, because it's such a big top thing, but I don't know if we've ever said uchi to soto directly, like in bullying. I think we talked about it at some point, like a bunch of making friends and stuff like that. We've talked about uchi to soto, but there's this idea, of the inside group and the outside group, and defining that. And then I wouldn't say, I mean, depends on what context you're talking about how, what's it called, defensive you would be about like the uchi versus soto or whatever, because in America there's a lot of more blatant, I would say, racism and things like that, where in Japan it's a little different. But yeah, just keep that in mind. That's kind of how a lot of these like lines are drawn, especially being Japanese too. Being even within Japanese, there's an idea of uchi and soto. So you could be Japanese to an American, but to one Japanese person, you couldn't be Japanese enough, and then that puts you in the soto category. And I think this is the segue I was saying, but Ayami, for example, also has had problems or whatever, or I guess not problems, but even you, born and raised in Japan, have had situations plenty of times, whether it be like being asked by your teachers about your like spelling of your name and being questioned about where you're from, or
そうだね、なんだろう、例えばあるね、新しいところ行ってね、今ホスペロズでいろんな課を回ってると。で、その回ってる時に自己紹介するじゃん。自己紹介したり、あとこんにちはっつって挨拶したりする時に名前を言うわけよ。で、まず漢字を見てなんて読むのって言われるの。で、じゃあで〇〇ですって言うと、すごい珍しいねってまず入って、で、どちらの方って言われるわけ。
Yeah.
そう。で、ちょっと実は、そうです、祖父母が台湾から日本に来てっていう、話をするわけ。それを毎回するの。
Yeah.
そう、1日にもうね、前回2回ぐらいしたのかな。2人全く違う先生なんだけど、なんて言うんだろう。珍しい名前だね。で、どちら出身って聞かれるから、もう多分そこで、日本人じゃないのかなって多分思われてる。
Yeah. I think something I find interesting about things like this, I don't know if I could consider that a microaggression. There's this term microaggression we've talked about before. I don't know if it would fall into that category or not, but so a lot of people, this might be like, they're just interested, whatever, which is true, whatever. They are interested in something that they don't see as normal or whatever. But I feel like the first step to defining uchi and soto is to try to like focus on a difference. I feel another example of that I mentioned once or something on the podcast was one of my professors, Japanese professors. He's like from Tokyo dude, so that means he speaks standard dialect Japanese and only speaks that dialect of Japanese. And if he ever hears a Japanese person speak standard Japanese or just Japanese in general, he will listen, and if he can hear anything that's not standard Japanese, he will make it a point to be like, where are you from? Like, where are your parents from? Like, are you from Kansai? And he'll make some comment about it. But to me, I hear that as and maybe this might be hearing too much of it.
オフェンシブに聞こえるの。なんて言うんだろう。その相手が例えばその先生はさ、ただ好奇心があって curious で聞いてる or なんていうの、自分がなんていうの、その純粋 pure な
Japanese
そう、だと思ってるから、ちょっと君はちょっと劣等だよみたいな、ちょっとインフェリアねっていうのを示すためみたいな、どっちの捉え方もできるよね。
Yeah. Well, I think it's both. I think it's a little bit of both. Where and in that moment, that other Japanese person hypothetically becomes a little more soto-er than they were before. You know what I'm saying?
そうね、わかる。
And so I feel like another thing that with this uchi soto conversation, another thing that I want to distinguish for, I'm using xenophobia in the title of this episode as well as the description, and not racism for a reason. I mean, one, because racism is a little more inflammatory, but the other reason is I feel like although racism and xenophobia go hand in hand in the US, in Japan, I don't think they really do. Racism, I think, applies greatly when you're talking about inter-Asian East Asian conflicts between Chinese, like China, Japan, and Korea. There, I think you have some easy points for racism. But when it comes to, I guess, the average foreigner or even Japanese people within other Japanese people, like in these weird Japanese, like uchi soto battles, I think it's more of a fear of the unknown, or you could say, fear of the unknown leading to people being more risk averse. So like, I think it's very common, or at least said, that Japanese people are...
何じゃ怖いなんだろう知らないものが怖いからそうやって
It's not, I don't think it like kawaii is like a scary movie, but as an uncertainty, kind of like if you walk, okay, I mean, this is a good example. If you walk into a train and you see somebody, okay, I'm not going to, okay, we'll make the example less realistic and then make it more realistic. There's a guy with a bloody knife. There's nobody dead. He's just holding a bloody knife, smiling creepily on the train.
絶対殺してたろそれ
Well, that's your assumption. You haven't seen him kill anybody. You don't know where the blood is, but your assumption
ケチャップ
is...
かもしれないよね
Yeah, your assumption is that you don't want to sit by this guy on the train. Obviously, if you move that several layers down and be like, maybe he's... and the reason that's weird is people aren't... If everybody did that, and that's just how people sat on the train, you wouldn't think of anything about it, right? Like, if the world you live in is everybody just brings their knife to the train, or a more realistic example might be in America, people... and especially in like rural places in America, open and carry, so they carry their guns like on just casually a lot of the times. To somebody who's not used to that, they'd be that is basically the equivalent of the guy holding a bloody knife just up in public. But in what I'm saying for more realistic in Japan situation is that somebody who's not Japanese or somebody who's darker skinned, whatever, sitting on a train, and they just don't know what the person will do because they can tell that they're different from them, and then that puts them in a state of anxiety, and then whether you want to call that anxiety fear or whatever, then there's a secondary feeling of risk aversion. They don't want to put themselves into a risk potentially, even if the risk is just interacting with somebody, and then therefore that leads to, like I said, just xenophobia, the fear of others in this case. And so
なんか日本人ってなんかそのもちろん日本みんなと同じでいたいっていうのも他の国より多分あると思う。例えばみんながやってるからこれやんないといけないとか、あとなんだろう例えば学校で今日話してたんだけど、ランドセルって小学生が使うんだけど、
They're these big cube backpacks.
そうね。
まああれ I'd be like cube. They're like thick, like they're thick boy backpacks.
あれの目的はねちゃんと形があって硬いから教科書とかいろいろねなんかぐちゃぐちゃになんないとか、あとね、なんか起きた時に、刺されてもなんか後ろから刺されないとかよくわかんないけど、そういう安全面も考えてランドセルがいいよっていう話があって、でも別にランドセルは義務ではなくて、ランドセル背負わないといけないっていう義務はないの、法律とかで。
Yeah, wait, can we just back up for a second? You read somebody's opinion is that randoseru protects people from getting stabbed in the back, and that's why you have
私は勝手な想像だけど、でも実際なんていうの硬いから安全そうじゃん。
You just stab them somewhere else. What if there's a guy going around stabbing children, which has happened in Japan, by the way. Old men have stabbed children in like a school bus with knives. I don't think that randoseru is protecting anybody, you know what I'm saying?
要するにね、中の紙とかバラバラにならないとかいろいろあるわけよ。
Okay.
でメインポイントが別にこれランドセルは別に買わなくていいんだけどかといってバックパックを背負ってる人はいないの。バックパックは別に OK なんだけど、
You mean like American style or something?
そうリュックって言うんだけどね、日本語だと。Yeah. そうでもなんでいないかっていうと、多分ねこれね別に強制はしてないけど、みんなと違う行動をするとなんかあるからみんなランドセルを買うんだと思う。
I assume that the administration would probably actually get on you if you didn't do that though. Because when I initially brought this up, you said it's illegal. Your first intuition was that it was straight up
illegal
or not legal, sorry, against school policy. Or mandated by school policy. I mean, and if it's mandated by school policy, which is like a public school, then in that sense, you'd be bordering on illegal, right? You're breaking public law or public government law. But Yeah, anyways.
だから、まあ、要するにここで言いたかったのはみんなと違う行動したくないっていうのが日本人の心理なのかな。結構なんて言うんだろう、そういうのあると思う。アメリカ人だってさ、なんかルールがあっても全然破るでしょ。
I mean, no, I don't think I think there is on average more of a tendency to be skeptical of tradition, skeptical of established rules. It's not that you just break rules for the sake of breaking rules, but basically a rule has to. And I'm only talking about every community in America. I think has their own rules that they take as law. If that makes sense. Like in conservative America, like religion is one of those things, like guns. In very liberal America, it'd be about probably. I mean, not to go. I mean, it depends on the group because when you get it can be very hard. There's a bunch of very small sects and like different liberal sects, but it could be about how you define a given term, how a term should be defined. That's kind of like the battleground of liberal conversations. But yeah, now I just lost my train of thought. You're talking about
なんだっけ、そのなんだ、みんなと同じことをしたくないっていう。
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's what I was saying. But I was saying, so I think that Americans on average, depending where you're looking at it, are more likely to question why you have to do something, and then it needs to prove itself in some way. Somebody needs to explain it to you, and if it doesn't make sense to you, then you're just like, okay, I'm disregarding that rule. Even if it's a law, and I feel this way too. Like I will totally break a law. I'm not. This isn't an admission of anything. I'm just saying I will totally break a. So how I see it is, I have like what I believe is right and what I believe just whatever. And the more strongly I believe about it, the larger consequences I'm willing to take, even if my action is considered illegal. If that makes sense. But if it's like super small and I don't care about that much and I think it's weird, I'm like, okay, whatever, I'll abide by the law. But
ね、普通にさ、これも前話したかもしれないけど、まあホスペロで歩いてるとき、歩いていうかローテーションするときに髪の毛の色とか、まあ、禁止されてるわけよ。金髪はダメとか明るい色はダメとかね。
Yeah.
そういう、まあ、勝手にルール作られて、でそのルールに従わないといけないんだけど、なんか黒自分の自然の色にしないといけないのね。
Yeah.
でもそれって別に何の理屈もないわけじゃん。ただ人がなんか医者とか学生がこういうね髪の毛の色をしてたら信頼を失うからやめてくださいみたいな。
I don't know if this is circular logic, but to me the logic goes something like this. Everybody expects doctors to have black hair, therefore doctors should have black hair. And you're like, okay, so like it's almost like the conclusion, well, yeah, it's almost circular logic. So by definition, doctors should have black hair, therefore they should have black hair. And or maybe the way that someone would actually frame it is, if you don't have black hair, people will feel uncomfortable because doctors should have black hair. And so,
あれか鶏が先か卵が先かのみたいな感じじゃん。
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about like a logical fallacy where normally you need to provide a basis of evidence to support a claim, but in a circular logic, your claim and your evidence are the same thing. So it's like, why should you have black hair? Why should doctors have black hair? Because doctors have black hair by definition. But yeah, anyways, some other things I wanted to expand upon with like xenophobia in Japan. As we described, but we didn't go into too deeply, I highly recommend checking out the Bing Japanese if you want to know how, I guess, different sects of Japaneseness and how that looks like in terms of how, what?
いや、じゃあなんかよく日本人は純日本人とか言うの。純っていう言葉を使うの。pure。
Yeah.
例えば、あの子ちょっとハーフっぽいねみたいな。いや、うちの両親ともどっちも日本人で純日本人ですみたいな。その純ってだって意味わかんなくない？絶対さ先祖でさ、まあ、朝鮮半島から来てね、まあ、中国韓国の方から日本に来たかもしれないしね。なんならだって遡ればさ、みんなアフリカのね、なんていう大陸の溝から生まれたわけだからさ、 そんなこと言ったらさ、なんか純ってないじゃん。けど日本人は pure っていう言葉を使いがち。
I mean, I definitely think though this is just the an unavoidable problem of definitions. You know what I'm saying? Or groups. Is if you form a group, that the group to have any sort of meaning has to be associated with some idea or some at least perception of some idea. For example, we can agree that I'm not Japanese. I feel like we can agree on that, which means that there are a certain set of something that makes someone Japanese. So if you look at like the 7 different Japanese criteria or something, I don't think anybody would disagree that a person who meets all the criteria, like their citizenship is Japanese, their genes are Japanese, they can speak Japanese fluently, they're born in Japan, they currently reside in Japan, they have a perfect cultural literacy of Japan, and they subjectively identify as Japanese. Everybody would agree that that person is Japanese. But once you start to like take away from those categories and let's say, okay, they're not genetically Japanese, they're not competent in Japanese, at some point, everybody, like, people will start being not Japanese, not Japanese, not Japanese. So I feel like anything with these definitions is kind of just a game of group consensus, which makes it difficult for an individual to define it, because it's a more like, you know what I'm saying, the group technically is what is making these definitions. But you can't ask any individual to give a definition that is like going to be truly representative of the group as a whole.Which is why I think it can be very difficult to these definition questions.
待って、ここのさ、デフィニッション今7つあるのか。で、これね、日本人はナショナリティとジーンズに一番重きを持ってると思う。なんでかっていうと、例えば、帰国子女の人とかね、は、アメリカで生まれる。で、その language competence も、ずっとね、例えば幼少期ずっともう高校生ぐらいまで英語を使ってた。で、日本語はちょっと片言。でも日本に帰ってくるとそれは日本人って捉える人がほとんどだと思う。
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you, but that's because they perceive, you know what I'm saying, that's perception when you see somebody. If I look,
そう、だからナショナリティとジーンズが一番
Well, yeah, what can be seen without knowing, all the other things you can't see.You can't see that by looking at somebody, if that makes sense.
どういうこと？
I cannot see someone's current, like, I can't see someone's language competency by looking at them. I can't see their...
でも喋っても、例えば、ちょっと、日本語は片言だけど、でも...
No, that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying the genes you can see. You cannot see the other things. Therefore, that is the only information available to other people, to society, basically. If you yeah, and so I think that's why they're, but yeah, I wanted to, because like I said, that's a real big topic. I wanted to focus on foreigners. So like I said, let's assume that you know what Japan is and what Japanese people are. I do think the experience is very different depending on what kind of foreigner you are. And so I made a list of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a kind of different types of foreigners. And I believe, like I said, we've talked about once before, but just for completeness sake, the white. So I'm putting a white super vague or super open. Obviously, white people from a lot of different locations. But I think, generally speaking, that if you are lighter skin, or lighter hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, the closer you get to that, obviously you'll always be this soto, you'll always be separate. But I think you'll have a way easier time navigating your way in a sense where people they're assuming the best of you. And do you have any conflict with that?
そうだね。
Like, so instead of seeing you as a person holding a knife and a bloody knife in the train, you are assumed to be somebody who is maybe skilled, maybe wealthy, maybe, I mean, not assumed, maybe people will think you're handsome, whatever. Now, the other category, we can go deeper into each one, but I just want to get what I was saying, is East Asian. So if you look East Asian, I think the assumptions will be that even as much as Japanese people say that they hate one kind or whatever, and they can easily identify one person is Japanese, one person is Chinese, one person is Korean, not always the case. And I think if someone is Asian, then they get assumed to, if they make a mistake, then they get assumed they made the mistake as a Japanese person, whether or not they're Japanese. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if I make a mistake, it's a foreigner made a mistake. If an East Asian person makes a mistake, then they're like, you should know better, even if that person isn't Japanese.
ああ、ね、ちょっと強く当たっちゃうみたいな。
Well, yeah, they have higher expectations. I think they're like easier to blend in, I guess I could say, with society, but
ああ、ちょっとなんていうの、まあ白人に言うなんていうの、ちょっとまあ遂行する遂行かするね、白人様がまあミステイクしてもまあしょうがないよねみたいになるけど、イーストエイジアンだとちょっと何やってんだみたいな。
Yeah, exactly. But I think that part of that comes because of the fact that there's what would you say? I don't even know if it's a union. It's weird. Part of it is that they have more similar, obviously genetically, it's more similar on average. So you do have ambiguity where it's hard to identify where someone's from. But I do also think that despite how much Japanese, Korea, and China hate each other, there is still a unity as being part of Asia. I don't know about East Asia specifically, if that makes any sense. I don't know if it comes from the idea like if they do something bad, then Asians as a whole look bad. I don't know how. I don't think they think about it like that. But I'm just saying from my experience having friends who are Korean American or Chinese American, whatever, or who've been to Japan or whatever, they don't tend to get as much attention. You know what I'm saying? From Japanese people. And I mean attention as in like you're sticking out.
目立たないってこと?
Yes, exactly. Even though technically
まあそれ見た目が似てるからじゃない。
Yeah. But I'm saying, but I'm saying just because they're niteru doesn't mean that any Japanese person would want to call a Korean person Japanese. You know what I'm saying? It's a weird boundary where the Japanese people, in theory, so for example, let's go to the next one.
近い。分かった。なんか近ければ近いほどさ、なんかもっと細分化して分けたくなるんじゃない?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
なんかメモリがちっちゃくなる気がする。
Well, because I'm saying
threshold がなんかちっちゃくなる、低くなる気がする。
Yeah, because I'm saying the most well-known, obviously thing, the most difficult, what you say, skin color of being in Japan is like the darker you are, the more difficult it is, just generally speaking. You get the least, you could say, good faith, like, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Like I was talking to IME about how in many places in Tokyo, they hire people from Africa, or like literally allow them to pay them to come over, and then they get them to basically solicit whatever, some store or shop, and then to get them to come in. And there might be a lot of reasons why they do that, but it doesn't help the perception that if you're talking to somebody who's black or dark-skinned, then you're talking to somebody who by default is assumed to be less or untrustworthy, more violent, more aggressive, whatever. And obviously there's like you could say there's like historical racism coming into that, but I think from the Japanese person's perspective, they don't think about it that deep. They just have the preconceptions from other cultures or whatever, and then obviously this risk aversion thing. And then I have the what I put here is racially ambiguous, where obviously I think like the darker you are, the worse you have it, generally speaking, in terms of benefit of the doubt.
なんだろうね。まあちょっとバカな質問かもしれないけどさ、コリアンの people はさ、すごい肌白いじゃん。
Yeah.
そのthe whiter you are のそのthe whiter you are だとなんかいい待遇を受けるっていうのは、それは白い肌をしたコリアンは入るの入らないの?
It depends who you're talking about. From American perspective, no. But Korean people. If you were to take like who is the closest to resembling a piece of paper, like to that color, I feel like Koreans would probably be number one in the world.
そうだよ。
Yeah.
だけど要するになんていうの?
Like not white people. That's a whole separate discussion. But the only thing I wanted to mention was about the racially ambiguous is that I think like. So, I mean, from my personal experience with having like very mixed blood, you could say, in genes.
アジアの血だけが入ってない。
Yeah, basically. And the benefit, so the downside is because I'm a little darker. I'm aware that like, so I'm a guy, I'm taller. and I'm a little darker skinned. So I'm aware in any given interaction I'm at that there's going to be a little, I'd say, negative tension. So there's an assumption that or maybe this is me thinking about this, but I'm pretty, I also feel like I've had enough situations that I've had to de-escalate very quickly, where the assumption is I'm slightly untrustworthy, not as untrustworthy as somebody from Nigeria, but slightly untrustworthy, and slightly all the bad things. But the one benefit I will say, and I mentioned this before, just to people in Japan, so we can wrap this up. Big topic, but whatever. We probably try to talk about too much. Is at the very least, if you're studying Japanese, you will not be assumed to not speak Japanese, and that is my takeaway. Like as long as you're not white, you will not be assumed by default to not speak Japanese.
Not speak Japanese.
Correct. So like, I feel like the only ethnicity that gets so if you're like very light skinned, you get a bunch of benefits, but you will forever always be assumed to not speak Japanese.
そうだね、確かに。絶対まあなんか、わかる、
Yeah. But yeah, we covered a lot in a bunch of different sections of like this conversation, and probably each one of them by themselves. Like I said, being Japanese is just focusing on first questions, like 30 minutes. But these are kind of our thoughts about, is Japan xenophobic? We didn't discuss where that comes from, but how it feels like for different people, different ethnicities in Japan. So yeah, let us know if you have any thoughts. Yeah. 戻りました。
We're back.
今週、新しい動画がアップロードされました。オーディオブックに関する動画なので、ぜひそのことに興味があれば、メインチャンネル見てください。
Yeah, lazyfluency. We're getting more attention. Yep.
そう、最初の動画はね、何でしたっけ？ The Katakana Rant。でも、タイトル忘れてしまったけど。
It went 1.5k views?
そう。徐々増えてるので、他の、だんだん増えるといいね。でもとにかく、今週の話したかったことというと、どうやって友達を作るかに関しては、動画やったことはあるでしょ。ポッドキャストで。それで、今週他の、その動画、ポッドキャストエピソードで話してないんだと思うんだけど、ミートアップとか、日本だと、つなゲート。つなゲート、わかる？
It's like a Japanese version of meetup.
そう。
Yeah, I've never seen, but yeah.
全然話してないけど、こんなことを使った方がいいと思
う。Yeah.
どう？今週初めてやってみた、ミートアップというのアプリ。他の国で使ったことあるんだけど、日本だと初めて。
Yeah. So like, it was English only cafe.
そう、東京のやつ。
Yeah. And then there's language exchange meetup and also board game meetup. Yeah. And like if you go to this kind of opportunity, you can find people who like the same thing as you do. So it's really good, and meeting new people is always good. But it's intimidating at first. But yeah, it was a good experience.
ということは、日本の友達とか、日本の友達っていうか、それは日本人じゃないかもしれないけど、日本に住んでる他の友達とか、外国人は日本に住んでるとか、そういうような友達作りたかったら、絶対、ミートアップはうまくいくと思う。で、ツナゲートは日本のミートアップというんですが、実際に会うことがほとんどないと思う。私が調べた今までのことに関しては、だいたいディスコードだけ。でも実際に会える機会がたくさんあるかもしれないと思う。で、アプリもあるから、つなげーと、つなげ。
つなぐ？つなぐ and ゲート。
そう。つなげーと。でもツナだと思ってた。
いや、つなぐ and ゲート。
つなげ。ちょっとダジャレだと思う。つなゲートとつなゲート。つなげるの。
だからつなげる。
そう。とにかくそれが日本の一番有名のミートアップアプリ。ということは、日本人と何かやりたかったら、つなげとやった方がいいと思う。どう？
Yeah.
で、この聞いたことある？つなげと。
Yeah, I've heard of this name, but yeah, like I said, I haven't tried.
うん。で、ミートアップを使ったのはこれも初めてだったってこと？
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I always wanted to try, but like going to a new place alone and meeting new people, it was too intimidating for me, and I was too nervous, so I couldn't step
out of my comfort zone?
yeah, out of my comfort zone. So yeah, but like if you're like nervous like me, you can go to this place with bringing your friends or like someone you know. Then that's less intimidating. So I recommend bringing some friends with you.
でも私たちの場合だと、私結局日本人に会いたかったという、日本人に会いたかった。でもドイツ人とインド人がいたんだけど、全然すごく優しい人だったので、文句言ってるわけじゃないんだけど、そのボードゲームを結構好きな人として、その他のボードゲーム好きの日本人に会いたいと思ってるだけ。でも他の人は4人しかいなくて、それはちょっと残念だと思ってたんだけど、とりあえず他の人は、私なんか以外の人、なんかボードゲームをやってたので、他の人はずっとなんか会話だけ、なんていうか、
yeah. Just a language exchange meetup, like another meetup. Yeah. So they attended that one, but not to the board game one.
多分注意すべきことは、language exchange とか cultural exchange の違いは結構大事。日本だと。language exchange は他の人に会うための、言語を学ぶための目的だけではなく、友達を作るためのこと。cultural exchange は大体、個人的な意見だけど、その、バーみたいな感じ。なんていうか、他の人と、なんていうか、付き合うためのやつだと思う。
for like a 合コン。
そう、なんか男が外国人の人となんていうか付き合いたいから、付き合いというよりも何でしたっけ、one night stand とかそういうようなことだと思う、主に。例えばその東京のいろんななんか500人が参加してる cultural exchange みたいなことあるわけないと思う。それで一応そういう、でもなんかそういうなんか飲むのが好き人なら、そのなんか language exchange よりも cultural exchange に行った方がいいかもね。その日本語だけ練習したかったら、その cultural exchange もいいかもしれない。なぜかというと、他の人は英語を勉強したいというわけじゃない。ただ、外国人の人と。
for aesthetic. Yeah, they just want to have like foreigner boyfriends. So I don't know.
Boyfriend かなんか
girlfriends.
One night stand とか。
So they're not looking for a language exchange. Probably, I don't know. It depends. But
一応日本語の練習になると思う。それだけです。ぜひ行ってみてください。And we're back with the final section. And if you made it to the final section, that means you should send an email to lazyfluency@gmail.com with questions language related and or otherwise, or drop a YouTube comment as well. We'd appreciate them as well, especially Japanese comments, Ayami.
皆さんお願いしますね。日本人の方、多分ね、シャイなのはわかるんですけどね。ちょっと書いてポストするわけだから、ね、簡単。
Yeah, especially app.The thing is, I know Japanese people use Apple. So if you have a phone and you're listening right now, you Japanese listener, I know you have Apple, which means you have Apple Podcasts, which means you could write a review on Apple Podcasts. We'd appreciate it. Anyways, this week, the first question is, or the question we're addressing today, is from Oddity, our MVP commenter, and it goes as follows. Why isn't Japan interested in cultural diversity, though? It can't all be xenophobia. Economics always trumps things like racism and xenophobia.Doesn't it need cheap manual labor like other first world countries? Not that I think cheap migrant workers is a particular positive socio-political phenomenon, but it's the prevalent way to diversify a population. Innovation aside, an influx of foreigners could solve its negative population growth and income and increase taxes income. Yeah, I mean, this is a complaint that many people, like my professor in Japan or Tokyo raised, like more liberal, like you could say, professor, in many young Japanese people also think as well, is why aren't there more people, I guess you could say, or why isn't it interested in cultural diversity? So I guess the first thing to address is Japan is an island. The government, I feel like, which is the question here, is why are they not interested in cultural diversity? Well, I guess they're partially a representation of the people, or I should say the old people, and then I think that's where you get the answer to the question.
まあまあそうだね。なんかinterested in は、interested in 興味はあると思うけど、なんて言うんだろう、今のこの環境、セリングがそのダイバーシティを受け入れる設定になってないからなだけだと思う。No.
I mean, I think, my opinion, so for one, this was the comment that inspired this episode. But my kind of take on it is, as I mentioned before, Japan is run by old people. By a lot, is the oldest the oldest country in the world by
20% とかに
population.
なるらしいよ。あれ ?40%?
What do you mean? For what?
65歳以上。
It's already, the average age is probably it was 49 last time I checked, like was 2019. It's probably 50 now. Who knows? And so this is to say that things like innovation is not what that population set wants. They want stability. They want things for the same. And another thing I should mention is our whole discussion of xenophobia, uchi and soto. A country that defines everything outside of it as soto does not want them inside their uchi. So this is to say that Japan is for Japanese, from this perspective. And why would you bring, from this perspective, just being very clear, non-Japanese into Japan? It would make it less Japanese, and the lives of Japanese would become worse, because then you have to focus on giving benefits to non-Japanese people, and they are soto. And so I feel like that general idea is kind of what stems in the government, stems into the immigration policies. And Japan does actually have immigration for very low skill labor, and from like Chinese and like more culturally adjacent.
なんだっけ、東南アジアの人とか、なんか農業とかで学ぶためのビザ。
Yeah, and stuff like that. I mean, it's fairly common, I guess I should say, but it's mainly just as a necessity, because if they don't, they literally, like, I feel like Japan would be completely fine keeping itself the way it is and dying over having like another like period of drastic change, if that meant risking Japan losing its Japanness. Part of me understands, and part of me agrees to an extent, where a lot of countries, if you like have a massive influx of another population, you get a lot of conflict. I could reference anywhere: America, Singapore before it got weirdly dictatorshiped and redistributed, Europe right now. I mean, so I understand where that comes from. You are, by just influxing a large percentage, risking a cultural conflict. Whether or not that should be a thing that happens, whatever, it just happens. When you have multiple cultures together, it is what happens. Obviously, there's a bunch of benefits, and you could argue that if you can find a way to do so without losing whatever you deem to be like key aspects of Japan, let's say, like I'd be something interested to hear, is if they could run statistics, right? What is most important to you about Japan? And if there's a way you can still keep those things, whether it be like safety, reliability for transport, maybe an appreciation for traditional Japanese culture, I feel like you can still have plenty of people like, I appreciate those things. I appreciate traditional Japanese culture, but I'm not Japanese. So I'm saying, so there's definitely a space in there for that. But I don't think the government is, or not think, the government straight up just isn't as willing to like open up all the doors and let people in.
あれじゃあなんかまあなんだっけ、ドイツ人の人が言ってたさ、ビザなんかworking visa を取るのが難しいだっけ。
Yeah, it was like very and every part of the process ended up being slowed down more.
で、英語を喋れる人がいなくて、で、なんか手続きがめんどくさくてとか。
I mean, yeah, and then there's also the other end problem. So it's not just why isn't Japan, let's say government, interested in cultural diversity? This whole idea of uchi and soto can lead a lot of people to not staying in Japan long term for many reasons. If you can't find any friends, don't have any connections to begin with coming to Japan, it can be difficult if you don't know what to do, or just even if you do know what to do, to let people allow you to be in the uchi. And if you're not in the uchi, you're not going to be really having any close friends. Nobody's going to be relying on something or for like anything. You don't have anybody to rely on. You don't have people to hang out with, etc., etc. And this is to say that you're probably not going to stay there for a long time. And something we've talked about in other episodes. So it is a problem. I'm not sure. People, that is how a lot of countries tend to handle I mean, diversifying their population. But I don't think people do that for the purpose of diversification. I think they do it to offload slave labor, basically, onto another population.
ダイバーシティを受け入れる受け入れないのやつでさ、日本の中学高校とかで第二言語とかやるのかな、アメリカだと。
Yeah.
それが第二言語英語しかないからさ、そもそもバリエーションがないんだよ。だからさ、なんていうの、そういうその多様性の価値観ないんだと思う。それもつながってないか。
Well, I mean, something I was thinking about is I don't think any country that I can think of. So the way the question is worded is, why isn't Japan interested in cultural diversity? Doesn't and so the like diversity, but like, it's the most prevalent way to diversify a population. That sentiment, I don't think any country actually has that sentiment. Like, I don't think any country in the world, including America, diversifies its population because it truly believes in diversity. To me, from like all the policies in American, whatever, as being the diverse place, whatever, it's you do so because you have to for one reason or another. Because people like power, especially when you have like a power concentrated in the hands of like one specific group, don't want to give up any of that power. And so unless they have to because their country's dying and they want to maintain their lifestyle and they have to bring in, for example, in the U.S.'s circumstance, we bring in people from a bunch of places, Mexico, other whatever locations. And a lot of it comes in two categories. You bring them in for low skilled labor to offset Americans having to do jobs they don't want to do. Or you try to take the best from other countries to make your country more competitive. But I don't think you're doing it because you believe diversity makes more competitive. You know what I'm saying? Like a given company, they're just like, oh, this person like went through a bunch of school, they're a doctor, I want more doctors. But I don't think they're like, this person is Dutch or something, this person is German, this person's this place. And we believe that diversity will make us stronger in the long run. That's why we're doing it. I don't even think America does that. You know what I'm saying?
難しい。
I'm saying like diversity as something that is good for the sake of diversity, I don't believe is something that any country believes.
日本はダイバーシティがいいと思ってる。
No, I don't think any country. I'm saying I'm saying I don't think Japan does. I don't like in the long run, because this is saying why isn't Japan interested in cultural diversity? The more I think about it, I don't think any country is, and I feel like the countries that are diverse off of circumstance. You know what I'm saying? Like they either took over a bunch of countries like the US and imperialized them, and then they're like, well, I can't just kill everybody, which they have tried. The Indians, there's a lot of that's a whole story. I mean, and other populations and whatever. And so I guess I would say like, yeah, I mean, we've talked around the economic solutions, but I really don't feel like most countries are actually interested in diversifying. And then after the fact, like, yeah, no, we love our diversity. You know what I'm saying? Like we would have chose to make it this way if we could have. You know what I'm saying? Like even countries like Europe, or sorry, not countries like Europe, countries like what is it, Britain and stuff like that, or England, that general area, they have generally diverse, like they're more kind of like a more diverse America. But all I hear about it are complaints in terms of immigration, like immigrants coming in and taking their jobs. Even though from the government's perspective, the whole point of immigrants coming in is to take low-wage jobs in the first place.
確かに。
Yeah. So I don't know if this is me being too pessimistic about people not actually caring about diversity, but yeah. Do you have any thoughts about why Japan isn't culturally diverse? Or any more thoughts?
みんな同じ考えを持ってるからじゃない？同じ人種で。もうそこに尽きると思う。
in the
いろんな人がいたらいろんな
But I'm saying, do you think that is like from the government's perspective? Because I'm saying is like it can't be all xenophobia. Like economics always trump things like racism and xenophobia. They're saying like economically, it seemed like Japan could like help itself a lot because there's a lot of economic problems, but they haven't. Do you think that's because? Do you think like Japan actually? It is this notion of like uchi and soto that's so strong that is holding the government from opening itself up.
そうだと思う。
Okay. Yeah. One thing to mention is like that is built in this whole notion of uchi and soto again is that it's not just that you think they're different. You think they're worse and like it's like it's not they're different and they're awesome because then you'd want them with you, right? You know what I'm saying? If everybody was different but in a really awesome way, you would want them together. I feel like a big part of the uchi and soto is you are not as good. Like I'm saying, so when we're talking about immigration, it's you're thinking about all the problems it causes, not all the benefits. You bring in immigrants, and especially you bring in dark-skinned immigrants, they're going to cause all these issues. And I feel like all those, that's the perception, I feel like.
日本人なんだろう。そうね。例えばコンビニのそのアルバイトとか結構今アジア人結構やってんだよ。そういうのも多分なんだろう日本人がやらないような仕事をやってくれると思ってるからそういうなんていうんだろうチープなジョブをそういう人たちに与えてる。
Yeah. No, okay. So those are our thoughts on that. Thanks for the question. That bell means we reach the end of today's episode. Thanks for joining us in another lazy conversation towards fluency. If you have any language-related questions and are just looking for general advice, send an email to lazyfluency@gmail.com. You might respond in the next episode. Also, make sure to check out our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and more. We'd appreciate the support. This has been Joey.
And Yami.
Signing off. じゃあねー。